Shavua Tov, Chag Sameach. I want to talk today about the the manna that the Israelites were fed with miraculously in the wilderness. And in particular, I want to look at the rules that are given for the manna, because that's interestingly kind of the first set of mitzvot, in a sense, that Bnei Israel are given after they make it into the wilderness. Or I don't know, we could quibble I don't know exactly what's first, but at least in a sense, it's sort of an early system of observance that they're asked to get plugged into. And I think it therefore shouldn't be surprising that it provides a model for a lot more in Avodat Hashem, and isn't just a sort of narrow set of requirements for this particular thing that applied then but doesn't apply now. So how do we see that? We have זה הדבר אשר ציווה אדוני לקטו ממנו איש לפי אכלו עומר לגולגולת מספר נפשותיכם איש לאשר בועלו תיקחו. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded, gather of it every man according to his eating, and omer for every man, according to the number of your persons, whom each of you has in his tent. ויעשו כן בני ישראל וילקטו המרבה והממעיט. ויעמודו בעומר ולא העדיף המרבה, והממעיט לא החסיר איש לפי אכלו לקטו. Okay. And the people of Israel did so, and gathered some more, some less. And when they did measure it with an omer, he who gathered much had nothing over, and he who gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. ויאמר משה עליהם, איש אל יותר ממנו עד בוקר. And Moshe said, let no man leave of it till morning. ולא שמעו אל משה ויותירו אנשים ממנו עד בוקר, וירום תולעים ויבש ויקצוף עליהם משה. However, they listened not to Moshe, but some of them left off it until morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moshe was angry with them. Okay, so that's the portion that we're interested in. There's also this extra set of details for Shabbat. You get to keep it over for Shabbat because you can't gather it on Shabbat. And so, the first basic thing is that the man seems to kind of work in this way when you read it, especially as a child, kind of in this Lost Boys imaginary food way, where talking about the sort of Peter Pan story, like that you get to eat whatever you want. It's not unrelated to midrashim that are told about the man, but there's this sense of just it all works so smoothly. It all isn't like the real world where we have problems. Everyone gets exactly what they need, and they're all satisfied. And normally it doesn't behave in a way where you can keep it over till the next day, except on the sixth day you can collect a double portion, and then you can keep it over. So it has this kind of perfect functioning that is in line with the sense of this is what you need to do in order to keep the Torah properly, and so it's going to work in line with that. And what's interesting is that when you think in those terms, there's a question you could nonetheless ask that comes to mind, which is, how did people know how much man they needed, right? Like, it's easy enough to read it and just think, oh, everyone took what he needed because that was what he was commanded to do. But first of all, that's doesn't quite make sense, because there were people who discovered that the man didn't keep until the next day, so it rotted. That means they took more than they needed, right? They had extra, first of all. And second of all, it does raise a question, again, how do you know how much to take? How do you know how much you're going to need? Isn't there some kind of anxiety that you're going to have about that? Now, at a certain point, you could say maybe some of the problem was people who were kind of saying, oh, I'm, a hoarder. I can't resist the temptation to try to just grab as much of it for myself as I can, and, have a week's supply. I don't know when I'm going to get access to this food source again. And that, I think, is the basic thing that this um, rule about not keeping over is dealing with is this is food that's based on emunah, trust in Hashem, and so you have to show that emunah, and say, well, if Hashem can feed me miraculously today, He can feed me miraculously tomorrow, and I shouldn't worry or try to beat the house, so to speak. And yet, there's also this scenario you might imagine where someone, it's not that they tried to gather a week's supply or a month's supply of food just because it was there. It's also possible that they just weren't sure what they would need, and they took maybe a bit more than it turned out that they needed. Like they had to kind of discover empirically that this was too much. Because when we read this pasuk and it says some people gathered more and some people gathered less, and it says hamarbe vehamameit, sorry, velo ha'edif hamarbe, and that there was no sort of left over for someone who took much. So that is plainly inconsistent with the idea of it rotting, because there has to be leftovers for someone. But I think it's we read it and it kind of sounds like everyone knows what they're doing. But I think you could also say, look, there are some people who grabbed a lot, and they didn't have any left over because it rotted. Like in the final analysis, they didn't ultimately end up ahead by taking more. And then there were people who took less and they didn't end up needing more than they took, as it turned out. And I think what's interesting about this is that it points to a challenge in general in Avodat Hashem that I think is at the core of some of the most difficult choices that we have to make. And it's harder and more difficult in some ways than a lot of other aspects of what we think of as being like the main work of keeping the Torah. Because often when we think about keeping the Torah, we think, okay, there's positive mitzvot and negative mitzvot, or in other words, positive commandments and negative commandments. There are things you should do, and you should do them. And there are things you shouldn't do, and you should not do them. And your sort of existential struggle is all the difficulty of maybe failing to accomplish the things that you're obligated to do, or also maybe yielding to temptation and doing some of the things that you're not supposed to do. And those are your transgressions, and you're trying to, eliminate your transgressions and get them all down to zero. But that clearly is sometimes what we're struggling with, no question. But at other times, you could say, all right, what if we've dealt with all of those kind of easy cases? I'm going to try to do the things I'm supposed to do. I'm really good at avoiding doing the things I'm not supposed to do. Let's say I have that all worked out. But then you kind of zoom in and you think, all right, so you're living life, you face a lot of different competing concerns, and there's more than one thing you're supposed to do. There are things that you're trying to avoid doing that impinge to some degree on your ability to do some things that you're supposed to do. And before you know it, you're doing all of this complex, multivariate load balancing where you're trying to figure out, well, with my finite effort, my finite resources, what should I get done well? What should I skimp on? What is going to end up outcompeting what else in terms of what actually gets accomplished? And those are some of the most difficult decisions, right? We obviously all sometimes actually transgress rules and do things we're simply not supposed to do, or fall short and simply just in an unforced error miss something that we were supposed to do. But a lot more of the time, we are choosing between things that we could do, and sometimes that choice is very painful and not at all obvious even to a well-meaning person who's trying to keep the Torah really well, who wants to serve Hashem really well, however you want to think about it. They want to do the right thing. But there's more than one thing they could do, and they trade off against each other in some way that seems hard to avoid, right? Like, are you going to be a very sort of strict teacher of Torah to your children because that way they'll really learn it? Or are you going to be merciful and therefore let things slide and, end up, setting less of a strict example on the one hand, but maybe also, showing them how to be merciful like Hashem is merciful on the other, right? You can make a million examples like that one where it's very hard to just say, pick one. Oh, that one obviously is always better. Obviously, sometimes you need to lay down the law with kids. Obviously, sometimes you need to be merciful and everything in between. And, so there's a million different aspects of trying to do the right thing that work this way, where even along one axis, there seems to be kind of a trade-off between two different things that you could say are good. And at some level, they're the correct thing under certain circumstances when you're trying to keep the Torah. And it's not at all obvious, or it's not easy to make a hard and fast rule and say, do this and don't do that. And it can be very painful on top of that psychologically to feel like no matter what you do, you're failing at something, or you're skimping or shortchanging some value or some mitzvah that is important, and also even just the anxiety of wondering, is this what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted me to do? And when you attempt to do things and you fail, and you run that through your calculation of like, was that actually what I was supposed to be doing? Did I fail because Hashem is telling me that I didn't really prioritize the right thing? That's endlessly difficult. And I think a large part of the psychological torment that we may experience in the course of trying to do the right thing is all the different uncomfortable trade-offs that we face in living life in the real world, where there are these kind of stringencies and let's say contradictions that we encounter that we have to sort of resolve through action by deciding on how to strike a balance or what compromise to make. And we don't finish with that job, and we don't ever, even when we're very good at doing what Hashem wants at some level, there's no one who can claim, okay, now I've got that worked out. I always can feel with 100% confidence that I know I chose the right balance to strike among 9 different things that it seemed like maybe Hashem might have wanted me to do that had to be kind of prioritized in some order. And so when we think of that as, in broad terms, now take it back to the man, I think in particular, it seems like it makes sense that man could provide a bit of a model for this, right? The man is, as we said, this very early way of learning to deal with mitzvot and avodat Hashem in the Midbar. It seems at first like it just pertains to man, but at some level, it's like a chance for Bnei Israel to practice the hardest thing psychologically about serving Hashem, which is that you now have to decide, okay, how much are you going to take for yourself? And, if you take too much, it's going to be left over and it's going to rot and it'll feel to you like you failed. The rotting will feel to you like a failure, because rotting always has that connotation, but also it's like a sign that you didn't fulfill the commandment properly. But you could say like, oh, yeah, so don't worry about it. Just take less, right? What's wrong with that? It says in the Torah, everyone who took less, they had what they needed. But why is that not easy? It's not easy because if you take 0, you're going to starve to death, right? So how much more than 0 is okay? And who knows that a priori, right? You could always say, oh, maybe you could take less and you'll be fine. It's miraculous food. Take even less, take even less. And what's interesting is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't just make their hunger vanish and say, all right, while you're in the midbar with me, I've got you covered. You don't need to eat. Um, you're taken care of miraculously. He miraculously gave them an activity that they had to hem and haw about and sort of worry about whether they're doing it correctly. He gave them a microcosm of Avodat Hashem by giving them rules that they had to obey in connection with, with this food source. But the point is that it's not an accident that it's about food, right? He could have given them all sorts of mitzvot in the desert that were sort of training wheel mitzvot. But why does it have to do with food? It has to do with food because food is the bedrock. Food is about life and death for people. It's our most basic instinct, which is why Gan Eden is about food, right? We are, from a biological standpoint, more and more complex architecture that developed around a digestive system. Because that's what it is to be alive at a basic biological level. It's a way of digesting food and harvesting nourishment from it. And then everything else, our hands and our eyes and our brains and stuff, is like to help us get the food from a narrow biological standpoint. So if we view it in those terms, it's like the anxiety you have about getting enough food and not starving to death, that is the most basic fear that human beings are capable of having at some level. Anxiety about food scarcity and hunger and those kinds of instincts are the foundation of every other way in which we worry about the future. And to the degree that that's the case, it provides us with a way of experiencing the sense of, okay, I have to do the mitzvah right. I also need to eat. I need to live. And I'm trying to kind of balance those against each other. And it even is part of the mitzvah, doing the mitzvah right, to eat and to live, but I can overdo it. And if I yield too much to that anxiety about food, then I'm taking more than I need. And so it's not easy to just say to someone, oh yeah, the easy thing with the man is you just take, an infinitesimal portion and you'll be fine because it's miraculous food. So don't worry about it. The whole point is that people are supposed to worry about it and be judicious and make a decision based on experience that, on the one hand, does suffice for them materially, and on the other hand, doesn't overreach. And I think that now we can dig around for some other things in the text about man that maybe are consistent with this idea a bit. And I think there's a few different ways into this topic. Maybe like the most basic point we could make first is that man is described in the Torah as being like two things. There's also something about being like wafers with honey, so I'm not going to take that up other than to elaborate on it in Nevi'im in a second. But in the Torah itself, it's described as being like coriander seed, but the phrase in the Torah is zeragad, and like bdolach, which is bdellium, some kind of maybe precious stone. It says Uhaman kizra gad hu wa'ino ka'in habdolah. All right, so the manna was as coriander seed, and its color is the color of bdellium, is how that's translated. But that's just an invitation to investigate, right? I have no idea what it means to say it's like coriander seed or like bedolach, and we have to try to flesh that out in the Torah itself. So in the Torah itself, we have, I think, two different consistent indications. First of all, what is bedolach? Bedolach is mentioned in the Torah elsewhere only once, and that is when we're in Gan Eden. So we're talking about the rivers that surround Gan Eden, and one of them is the Pishon River. It says of the Pishon River that it is, right, so Shemai Had Pishon Hu Hasovev Et Kol Eretz HaHawila Asher Sham HaZahav Uzahav HaAretz Hahi Tov Sham HaBdolah Ve'even HaShoam. So the name of the first is Pishon. That is the one which flows around the whole land of Hawila, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good, and there is bdellium and shoam. All right, shoam is onyx stone or some kind of precious gem. So what are the things we can say about this? Well, it is interesting in a second to ask, what is Hawila, this place that's mentioned here because it comes up elsewhere. Before getting to that, let's say the name doesn't matter. It's in some land, which is, what are the characteristics of this land? It has gold and gemstones. Okay, so I think that in a basic way, we're just thinking about this as the B'dolach is connecting to the idea of Gan Eden, which we'll talk about more in a second, but it's also connecting to the idea of wealth. So the manna was like wealth. It was like gold and gems. In other words, people were relating to it as treasure that they were gathering up, which makes sense because, food is scarce. But I think that underlines how quickly the story with the man turns into a problematic one as far as people's behavior, because once you think man is like gold, you can't eat gold, right? Gold is money. Gold is precious, but when you collect gold, you're not doing it for your basic needs today. You're doing it so that you can amass wealth for the future. It's all about currency. It's all about exchange over the long term. So people couldn't help viewing the man in that way, and that was part of the challenge. That like anything of value, you view it not just as like, I'm going to take what I need right now. You start to view it as that I could maybe use a little bit more for later, and maybe I can trade some for something else. And it's in our nature to look at things that have value like that and start thinking in those terms, because we're planful creatures, and we understand about living in the world that there are good days and bad days, and on the bad days you need to have some kind of backstop, or else things can get worse. There's also an aspect here, though, I'll just mention as an aside, that this mention of shoam and gold. Shoam is the gemstone that's involved in the structure of garments that the Kohen Gadol wears in the temple, like the sort of shoulder straps for what's holding the Chush and Mishpat. And shoam also is on the Chush and Mishpat, among other gemstones. So I think it's not just about wealth, it's also about keunah, it's about priesthood. Gold and shoam together imply the big day keunah. They imply a sense of priesthood. And that's like the question of what is that connected to man is subtler, but I think it's there because if you think about the role of the priest is to be fed by the rest of the nation. The rest of the nation grows the crops, and the priests don't have land, and then they get torma and maaser, and they get their sort of stipend of food. And so it's showing you that the food of the Kohen is kind of like man in a sense. It's like food falls from the sky as far as they're concerned, and that enables them to do what they need to do. So it's just as an aside that it also teaches you something about how the man reminds us at some level of how the Kohanim are meant to be sustained within the ideal Israelite society. And I'll also just say that Hawila, this land Hawila, what is it? What do we learn in connection with that? I'll just mention that elsewhere we see, first of all, the Hawila is descended from Cush. So in other words, Hawila is kind of from the bad side of the family. I mean, that's unfair, but in other words, it's like through the line of Ham. So we're associating with things like Mitzrayim and Bavel. Um, and that is interesting because Hawila is also where Hagar and her son, who is probably Ishmael, or is usually assumed to be Ishmael, but I wonder sometimes. But anyway, where Hagar and the one who is assumed to be Ishmael end up settling. We have Vayishkenu mehawila ad shur asher al pnei Mitzrayim boacha ashura al pnei kol ahau nafal. And they lived from Havilah to Shur, that is before Egypt, as you go towards Assyria, and he fell in the presence of all his brothers. So I do think it's a little interesting because if they're in Havilah, then it kind of shows that maybe they were seeking that kind of kehuna, that priesthood. And that in turn points to a different explanation for why Sarah expelled Ishmael or expelled, let's say, Hagar and her son, who maybe is Ishmael, because usually, as a very much an aside, we assume that when Sarah says he will not inherit with my son Yitzchak, we assume that means that she's saying, over my dead body will he inherit anything, because I have a son, now, and he's going to inherit everything. But it could just as well be the case that she's saying, no, you have to divorce her and kick them out because they are refusing to let Yitzchak in on the inheritance, right? They're saying that they want to inherit, and have the firstborn status, and won't include Yitzchak in the inheritance. And if that's the case, then it makes more sense that Sarah said, look, I mean, it would have been nice to keep them around if we could share, but they're refusing to share. So now you have to make a choice, and so divorce her. If a choice is being forced. Now, that's a lot to read into the text on its own, but I'm just saying I noticed they settle in Havilah, which is like the land of priesthood, except it's more sort of Egyptian. So there's this sense of like, maybe if you want priesthood because you think it's about money, then you go to Havilah. All of that is an aside. But getting back to the main point with Man, it's gold, it's gemstones, it's currency, it's wealth, or at least insofar as people will relate to it as like something that has value assigned to it, where if you have the opportunity to gather more of it now, there's a very good argument for doing that. And that's why you have to now struggle with the temptation that's going to lead you to overdo it, to take more for yourself than you actually need. And so I think now we take this back to understanding the man a bit more. There's also, I should say, like, it was also described as being like zeragad, like coriander seed. I think that there's a consistent reading you can get from zeragad, which is that if zeragad is the seed of God, like the seed of God, the son of Yaakov, then it's interesting when you look at the census of Shevet Gad. They're counted as being 45,650. They're the only tribe that's not counted in around hundreds in that first census in the Torah. And why that is in the case of Shevet Gad is a separate question. But it really evokes a sense of counting up. 4, 5, 6 is like counting up to 7. And then like an extra 50, it's like you're measuring it very finely. So it's like someone who's really counting their money carefully. And that also is consistent, right, with this idea of, okay, so the man is like money that you really count in a miserly fashion or carefully. Like that's the risk with the man. That's the thing that we're worried people are going to get drawn into. And the point is that this happens under the best of circumstances, right? This is, in a sense, impossible. Hashem is saying, this is impossible to remove from Avodat Hashem, that even when you're just deciding how much to eat, so you don't starve to death, I will put you nose to nose with the worry that maybe you're going to take too little for yourself and fail that way, and maybe you're going to take too much and realize that you're therefore kind of trampling on another aspect of the mitzvah, and that you'll always have that kind of struggle that you're dealing with any mitzvah. And that's not going to go away once you get really good at it, right? Like you can get really good at keeping the Torah, and you can be like, okay, I don't murder people anymore, I don't steal anymore. I've purged those temptations, generally speaking, from my everyday life. But even when you're going around being very righteous, you never are going to be able to escape the kinds of choices that are like, should I be more generous to this stranger, and then as a result have less to provide for the education of my own children or something like that, right? Where both of those things sound great, right? Be generous to the stranger, yes, and also educate your children. But in practice, you encounter, especially with things like money, trade-offs that are not always easy to optimize, because you feel you're failing either way you go. So I think that always is hiding in the background of what the man is. And now I think the other aspect, just to wrap it up a little bit, is to say that there is an understanding at some level that this really goes back to Gan Eden in a different way. And Chazal play with this because they ask a question about Megillat Esther in Esther Rabbah, where they say, all right, where does, actually, I'm not sure it's in Esther Rabbah, they say, where does Haman, the name Haman, first appear in the Torah? And what's funny is you hear Haman and you're like, oh, I know it's going to be about the man, because that's how you say the man, Haman. But it's not, because then they go and they take you over to a different word in Gan Eden. It says, Vayomer mi higid lecha ki erom ata hamin ha'etz asher tziviticha levilti achal mimenu achalta. When Hashem is talking to Adam and saying, who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree I commanded you should not eat from? It's Hamin ha'etz, have you from the tree. So Hamin is not Haman. But I think part of the reason that Chazal are doing that is to actually loop all of them together. Because there is a reason, I think, that Haman in Megillat Esther is named Haman, like the portion of food that we're eating in the desert. But it also is connected with Gan Eden. Why? Because what we're saying about the man is it's all about this like painful psychological choice of how do you do the right thing when you have trade-offs between different good things you could do. And that's about knowledge of what's good and what's bad, right? Da'at tov v'ra. And Hamin ha'etz, asher tziviticha levilti achal mimenu achalta, have you eaten from the tree I command you not to eat from? That's about its da'at tov v'ra. So this Hamin ha'etz, what it's pointing at is what? The very idea that a person could have the judgment to know what's good and what's bad, and that they're making some decision of like, I know what's going to be right if I do things this way and not that way. And that is part of the psychological torment of, let's say, trying to do a good job while simultaneously trying to fulfill a bunch of different commandments that seem contradictory. It's that you're forced into the position of using your judgment and having some kind of way of evaluating what's good and what's right. And then you end up, having to question whether you made the right decision and not, really know whether you actually know that Hashem wanted you to make it the decision this way or that way. And so definitely the going from Haman, the food, to Gan Eden with Etz Da'at Tov V'Ra seems therefore appropriate, and that's maybe another reason that the Bedolach takes us back to Gan Eden, as to remind us of like, well, what was the Gan Eden about again? Oh yeah, it was about human beings maturing in their ability to exercise judgment about what's right and what's not, through Kadosh Baruch Hu giving them, interestingly, a kind of training wheels mitzvah of don't eat from the tree. Um, but what does it have to do with Megillat Esther, right? Like, other than the fact that the name sounds the same, at first it seems like it has nothing to do with Megillat Esther. But of course, that's not true. Of course, it does have to do with Megillat Esther. There's many ways in which it does, but I think actually now that we realize this also involves the food, the man, um, it makes it much more obvious, because you look at Megillat Esther and you say, what is the conclusion of Megillat Esther about, and what are the mitzvot of Purim? They're about portions of food, right? Mishloach manot are gifts of food that we're all required to give to each other, which is a very interesting mitzvah vis-a-vis what we're talking about with the man, because if everyone's giving manot, then you could just say, like, why don't everyone just keep their food, right? Like, you keep your food, I'll keep my food. We'll be like in stone. Sheli, sheli, v'shelcha, shelcha. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. And we don't need to be involved with each other. Like, what's the point of making people exchange food? Everyone had food to begin with, and now they're giving food, and they're deciding on the size of the portion of the food that they give out, and how much to give and not to skimp. But on the other hand, like, you don't need to give someone a truckload of food for Mishlach Manot. You have to give them a shi'or that satisfies the mitzvah, right? A quantity of food that satisfies the commandment. So the central mitzvah of Chag Purim, aside from reading from the Megillah and Seudat Mitzvah, like having a party and stuff, is Mishloach Manot. And really also Matzanot Le'Avyonim is about Mishloach Manot, because it's about making sure poor people have money so that they also can have portions of food for the holiday, right? So it's all about portions of food for the holiday. And so Haman, who's named Haman, and his story becomes the genesis of a practice that's all about sharing portions of food and making sure everyone gets portions of food, and everyone having to go and make decisions about how much food to give each other. And it's not a coincidence that his name is Haman. You might want to go deeper and say, well, but why is it that his name is Haman and he's trying to kill all the Jews? And what is that? Why is he a bad guy if his name is Haman? Like, portions of food sound like good things. Why is? But I think that the point is, he is, he represents, for example, like random chance and calculation, and there's a sense in which the antidote to Haman is Mishloach Manot, and that shows you that Haman represents maybe a kind of a negative aspect of the man, which is, I'm really worried about my money. I don't want to share it. I need enough for me. That there's a sense in which Am Yisrael is destroyed the more we look inward to our own needs, and we're less sensitive to the needs of others. And so the Mishloach Manot are meant to be an antidote to that. But in some metaphorical sense, Haman was going to destroy the Jewish people by representing a state in which the Jewish people no longer have concern for whether each person is getting a portion of food, and instead it's like a sort of self-involved calculation. But that's more extended, but probably somewhat unnecessary. I think the main point is that his name is Haman, which connects us to the manna in the wilderness. And the holiday ultimately is about something that clearly has connection to the manna in the wilderness, because it's all about everyone getting what they need to eat. But that's looped through the exchange to create a community based on generosity that fights against our tendency to just concern ourselves with whether we're getting enough to eat. So I think that rounds up all the different textual sources that I wanted to bring in. And we kind of already made the point, but just to summarize, I think that unlike many aspects of keeping the Torah that you can get better at and improve at, and kind of graduate from, not actually, but like we said before, there may be a point at which it's really difficult, some aspect of keeping Shabbat or some aspect of um, not transgressing uh, some rule, and then you become more disciplined or you understand it better and you get better at it, and it becomes second nature to do it right. But there are other aspects of this where I feel like, and this is why the man is brought in the way that it is, that you never really can remove from the experience of Avodat Hashem. And that is trying to decide how much to dedicate to one goal that seems to come at the expense of another. And there's always a great deal of potential for psychological pain in that situation because you don't want to fail Hashem, but He deliberately put you in a situation where it's correct for you to go in the direction of failing Him, meaning you're not supposed to take zero man. You're just supposed to take some man so that you don't starve to death. And the moment you take more than zero, you're headed in the direction of taking too much. And that means that you'll always have to agonize to some degree about, did I do this right? Did I give too much to this mitzvah at the expense of another? Or did I somehow overreach in what I calculated was the minimum I needed for myself? And, it is interesting to close then that with the man, if people took too much, the way you find out in a sense that you took too much is that your man, is left over and it rots. And then you have this negative experience. And I think maybe that may reveal to us that sometimes when we lose things that we have, it's worth examining the question of whether we didn't actually need them to some degree. We thought we needed them, but we might have been actually successful with less. And then we kind of pay the price of overreaching, and going to the other direction that it's interesting that no one who took too little ended up having to, or who took less ended up having too little with the man. The idea that it was not the case that lots of people starved to death because they were trying to not take too much and they took too little, and then it turns out they sort of went overboard with that. That there's a sense in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is watching over things, and that in general, you're not going to be punished for taking too little for yourself, or at least that there's kind of a safety net for that is hiding in the background of Hashem's orchestration of the events of the world. Now, again, you can't make a simple principle out of that and be like, okay, it's impossible for you to starve to death if you give all your food away. That's not what we're expected or commanded to do. But it at least means that we're part of the reason that we can endeavor to be generous, to make what we have available to others, to take care of each other, is because we know it's really all from Hashem, and He gave it to us, wanting us both to take care of our own needs, but also, beyond that reasonable limit, to concern ourselves also with what others need. And it can sometimes feel like you are walking on a tightrope, whether it's making decisions about money or about other things, and that it's easy to set a foot wrong and fall. But maybe part of what the Torah is trying to sort of nod at is, if you set a foot in what seems like a sort of dangerous place because you overreach in your generosity or in your self-restraint, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu is likely to, find a way to make that not be disastrous for you, if you're doing it with the right intention. So, Bezrat Hashem, we can all bring this kind of consciousness into all the choices that we make in keeping the Torah and taking care of each other, and perhaps it can make us a bit more generous.